the great influences of Monboddo? Well, he tells us in his own writings, which you can find in the National Library. Those whom I truly call philosophers, such as the Pythagoreans, Plato and Aristotle. See the common theme that keeps coming through again and again? He says, now, I think it's not all probable that the Indians invented so great a science. It came from Egypt. You see, a lot of the Freemasons at the time were convinced that Egypt was a great thing because you had all these hieroglyphics on the monuments there. And they thought, it's only a question of time. If only we could crack the code, we will be able to understand great science. Of course, when the Rosetta Stone was discovered, with Greek and as a translation of it and everything else, the code was cracked, and now we can translate hieroglyphics, and there was nothing of the sort coming out of Egyptian philosophy, much to Lord Monboddo's dismay, I would have thought. But, as I mentioned before, it was Sir William Jones who was writing from India to communicating with Lord Monboddo, said no, it was the Brahmin Hindus who were the originator of the theory of evolution. Now, here's some quotations from Lord Monboddo. He says, the orangutan, that's an animal betwixt a monkey and a man. 1768, he said that. Another one, there are, I know, many such should be, there are, I know, many who will think this progress of man from a quadruped and an orangutan to men such as we see them nowadays very disgraceful to the species. But they should consider their own progress as an individual. In the womb, man is no better than a vegetable. If therefore there be such progress in the individual, it is not to be that there should be progress, is it not to be that there should be progress also in the species from the mere animal up to the intellectual creature. 1795. Now we're getting to Erasmus Darwin, we're getting closer to home. Erasmus Darwin was the grandfather of Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, his father and his grandfather all studied medicine at Edinburgh University. Erasmus Darwin was a key philosopher and scientist from the Enlightenment period, and he came here and he was initiated into Freemasonry, and he attended the same Masonic lodge as Lord Monboddo and those other men there, and he was influenced by Lord Monboddo. In fact, in his own writings, he quotes and gives reference as an authority to Lord Monboddo. Now, what does he say? He wrote a book called The Temple of Nature in 1803, which is actually a poem. Well, it's actually, he died before then, but it was published in 1803. And you have here this poetry. Unfortunately for us, it has philosophical footnotes, so you don't have to try and guess what he's saying in his poetry, this esoteric poetry. But he says, in the Eleusinian mysteries, which came from Egypt, the philosophy of the works of nature with the origin and progress of society are believed to have been taught by allegorical scenery explained by the Hierophant to the uninitiated, which gave rise to the machinery of the following poem. Now, you're looking here. You can't really see it very well, but you have to take my word for it. There's a woman behind a veil with 3 breasts. And you've got 2 women here who are unveiling this, and down here and the back, there are all these people in worship and great celebration, ecstatic over the revelation of truth and so on. Now you think that's a bit of an odd thing for Charles Darwin's grandfather to have in his poetry. Well, all will be revealed. Some quotations from Erasmus Darwin about evolution and Pythagoras. Here's a quotation from his poem. So Erst the sage, he's referring to Pythagoras, with scientific truth, in Grecian temples taught the attentive youth. With ceaseless change, how restless atoms pass from life to life, a transmigration mass. And then he says, in the other book he wrote, Zoonomia, which is a scientific book, this idea of the gradual generation of all things seems to have been as familiar to the ancient philosophers as to the modern ones. So he's saying there's nothing new with modern day, and bear in mind he was before obviously his grandson, I guess, well, he did, not sure about the actual date, we wouldn't have met his Charles Darwin, wouldn't have, because I think Charles Darwin was 1809 when he was born. But that sort of time. And there he is, he's saying, look, you think this is new? No, it's not. It's been around for thousands of years. Here's a bit of a quotation from Temple of Nature. God, the first cause. Bear in mind, he believed that God triggered off everything at the beginning, but he also believed in an eternal universe like Plato. But he said, God, the first cause, in his terrene abode, young nature lisps, he is a child of God. From embryon births her changeful forms improve, grow as they live and strengthen as they move. Ere time began, from flaming chaos hurled, rose the bright spheres which form the circling world. Earths from each sun with quick explosions burst, and second planets issue from the first. Then whilst the sea at their coeval birth, surge over surge involved in shoreless earth, nursed by warm sunbeams in primeval caves, organic life began beneath the waves. And he says about, hence, without parent, by spontaneous birth, rise the first specks of animated earth. From nature's womb the plant or insect swims, and buds or breathes with microscopic limbs. So basically, he does have a first cause, a sort of understanding of God, but as a deist, which meant basically it's a cause there and everything carried on. But nevertheless, you have evolutionary understanding in here. And that last quotation there from Philosophical Footnotes, the Temple of Nature, basically says he believed an eternal universe that had a beginning. He talks about like a Big Bang explosion, and out of that comes the system, the solar system out of the sun and everything. And then he says that comes to an end, and then it starts all over again, and on, just like the Hindu way of thinking. Now, here's a quotation from his scientific work, Zoonomia, 1794. He says, from thus meditating on the great similarity of the structure of the warm-blooded animals, and at the same time of the great changes they undergo both before and after their nativity, and by considering in how minute a portion of time many of the changes of animals have above described have been produced, would it be too bold to imagine that in the great length of time, since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, would it be too bold to imagine that all the warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament or cell, which the great first cause endued with animality, with the power of acquiring new parts, attended with new propensities, these old words, directed by irritations, sensations, volitions, and associations, and thus possessing the faculty of continuing to improve by its own inherent activity, and of delivering down those improvements by generation of its posterity, world without end. So he's basically saying that all living things came out of one single cell. That's basically through a process of evolution. I won't read that, but basically he refers to David Hume, the atheist in Edinburgh, who also thought everything could have evolved by itself, but through completely natural processes. Both Erasmus Darwin and Lord Monboddo was friends of David Hume, disagreed. He said there was some sort of cause, a sort of a deity of some sort, whereas David Hume said there was some sort of first cause, but not, some sort of supernatural something. And that's a kind of a similar idea we got there. Conclusion then. The theory of evolution came originally from the Hindu Brahmins. We've seen that as we've gone through tonight. Secondly, this pantheistic form of evolution, that is pantheistic for those who weren't here, means that God is everything, the consciousness in everything, was passed down by Pythagoras to the Greeks. Thirdly, that Thales and his Ionic school of the naturalistic Greek philosophers branched out from the pantheistic evolution to naturalistic evolution. Part 4, Plato and Aristotle's evolutionary ideas were dispersed through the Alexandrian school in Egypt in a time when Christianity was coming to its ascendancy. The ideas were followed through into the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and into Freemasonry, where they were preserved. Bear in mind, I mentioned to you, Christianity had become very strong, so the ancient philosophy of this whole thing was kept, but it was kept within the secret societies. Freemasonry and Enlightenment, bear in mind as I looked there, the powerhouse for the Enlightenment in Europe were the Freemason lodges. And there was a rebirth of this philosophy of evolution which developed. And here in Edinburgh, Lord Monboddo, who many regard, a lot of Scots regard as being a father of human evolution and anthropology and evolution of languages, and Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, carried the philosophy forward until we get to Charles Darwin, who developed the idea. And as I said right at the beginning, we started with Charles Darwin, we've ended with Charles Darwin. And in his first edition, 1859, of Origin of Species, it would appear that he was the guy that came up with the whole idea. But as I said, a number of scientists pressed him and said, "You weren't the chap that came up with this idea. It's been around a long time before you." So I think grudgingly, in his sixth edition in 1888, he lists 22 scientists before him. And he even, as I said at the very beginning, made allusions to the classical writers, the classical Greek philosophers. And for those who weren't here at the time, I passed through from the classical there to the Hindu Brahmins and traced through to the Greeks through this whole process. So, what do I think about this? My personal conclusion is that evolution is a development of a religious philosophy rather than science. Here's a quotation from Professor Wolfgang Smith, University of Oregon. He said, "As a scientific theory, Darwinism would have been jettisoned long ago. The point, however, is that the doctrine of evolution has swept the world not on the strength of its scientific merits, but precisely in its capacity as a Gnostic myth. It affirms, in effect, that living beings create themselves, which is in essence a metaphysical claim. Thus, in the final analysis, evolutionism is in truth a metaphysical doctrine decked out in scientific garb. In other words, it is a scientistic myth." Very hard-hitting quotation from a professor of mathematics at a university. But there we are. And my personal understanding is this. I feel that natural selection and adaptation, as I said at the beginning, are scientific principles. They should be taught within the scientific departments. Evolution, I see rather as a philosophy, ought to be taught in the department of philosophy. That's my hope and desire. And I hope you've been challenged tonight.